Okay guys, so here's a video for the content of A4, methods of supporting the development of performance and fitness. This is part of our 6.1 assignment. So you can have a little look at the spec there, but obviously I'm going to go through each bit for you anyway. Question I guess to start off with is there's kind of two parts to this section, this A4 section on supporting athletes. One is to do with fitness and one is to do with goal setting. So some logical questions are, what might you give feedback to an athlete about? So what might be the topic of your feedback? When might you give feedback? And are there any different types of feedback? And I'm sure from your own experiences or from other courses, you may be familiar with some thoughts and some answers to those. So let's look at it. We're looking at purely the feedback element to this topic so far. So feedback on performance then. Feedback could be tactical, about tactics. Could be what tactics went well, didn't go well. What technical skills, what they're doing in terms of their technical skills. So it could be coaching points to improve or refine their technical performance. It could be related to fitness aspects, so elements of component fitness, so speed or acceleration or power, or of course it could be to do with effort, so feedback on how hard somebody is trying or needs to try harder. So there's different sorts of things people might give feedback on. I guess how do you give feedback, or when do you give feedback, I should say. It could be that feedback is given during an activity, a match or a training session. So this is at the same time as the athlete is performing. What you need to think about is, why might that be effective or why might that be problematic? You might give feedback at the end of a match or at the end of the training session, sort of immediately. And again, think about why might that be beneficial, where might there be any issues with that kind of feedback. Or perhaps in a half time or some kind of break in a performance. Or you could give feedback on a totally separate occasion. So this could be, the day after the match, 2 days after the match, midweek, between matches, something like that. So when feedback is given is quite important, and higher grades will come from your discussion on the pros and cons of these different timings of the feedback. Now, the language your spec likes to use for when feedback is given, and in terms of an analysis of this, evaluation of good and bad about this, is hot and cold feedback. So hot feedback they describe as feedback that is immediate, that you give pitch side, or in between, like a timeout in basketball or half time in hockey or football or netball or the quarters, so that it's relatively instantaneous, it's in the moment. And you might imagine there's advantages to that, in that it gives the players opportunity in that moment to adjust their performance in whatever type of feedback you're giving them, whether it's effort, whether it's technical, whether it's tactical. It might not be, you might not be able to do this kind of feedback though if it's a swim event, for example. Sometimes pitch side you can be heard, sometimes you can't be heard. And if the player is really consumed or involved in what they're doing, you can shout all you like. They either won't hear you or they can't concentrate on what you're saying and what they're doing. So there might be that level of sort of psychological arousal or physiological arousal that means they can't concentrate on your instructions. So hot feedback can be really important, instantaneous, in the moment, at the time. Maybe people can adjust to respond to what you're saying, but it's not assumed and not necessarily possible. It could be really noisy, it could be bad weather, they might not hear you, all sorts of reasons why that isn't possible. Obviously the opposite of this is cold feedback, and this is feedback that might be done later, at the end of the game, at the start of the next training session. Last time we did this. There's pros and cons to this too. So in between the time of the original performance and the feedback, it could be your players have already thought through things They might not react to your instructions. I mean, they could react badly if they're hyped up and you're telling them to do something different. Then they might not take that very well. They might have reflected. They might feel better about it. They might be more responsive to it. However, obviously, the opportunity to change that in that previous context is gone. They may have sort of blurred what was going on in the previous scenario and lost the sort of focus and the immediacy of it and be able to relate to it quite as much. So there's pros and cons to that. The next aspect of feedback is how to give feedback. Do you give feedback to the collective, to the whole squad, to the whole team at the same time? And I guess there may be times, if you are talking about team tactics or watching evidence or videos of your opposition together, then maybe it's really important to. Maybe it could be a group of the attackers that you talk to at once, and then you talk to the defenders in a different meeting. But there are, again, pros and cons of talking to the whole group, addressing the whole group. I mean, this picture perhaps suggests one possible risk of whole group discussion. You can talk about, as I said, collective goals or collective strategies. You could, if there's discipline, you could give some disciplinary comments together. You want everybody to hear your, general instructions. There can be merit in that. If you want to give general praise, of course, there's merit in that, and you can give that kind of feedback together. Versus, do you give individual or one-to-one feedback to your performers? And pros and cons to this too. It could be that within the squad there's a couple of people you need to have a word with about something perhaps a little bit more negative. Is it appropriate to do that in front of everybody or to do that one-to-one? Everybody might have different needs, so maybe there are occasions where if you went through everybody and talked to everybody individually while everybody's there, time consuming for everybody, what a waste of time for some. So there's pros and cons of talking and giving feedback as a group versus giving one-to-one feedback. And again, here's some sort of guidance on the group. So group is obviously talking to lots of people at once. You can hear their opinions collectively, so they can maybe have their own perspective on feedback from the game, feedback from training, what they think their strengths are, what they think they need to work on. That could be really valuable, that the whole team hears their peers' ideas. And of course, if you're talking about group strategy. But it might be less relevant to some players. They might just get bored or switch off. It might be possibly dodgy or embarrassing or uncomfortable, demoralising for some people to experience negativity perhaps about them or their position collectively when they're all together. And then, of course, individual feedback, again, pros and cons. It's very focused, it's very personalised, but again, might be a bit too intense for some, and people might get defensive. So I think there's just a couple of summary slides here just to try and draw things together a little bit on the when and how to give feedback, hot or cold, or individual, one-to-one, or group feedback. And again, here's some elements. So actually, concurrent and terminal is A-level, when we teach A-level PE, this is the language we use. Concurrent means at the same time as, which is like your hot feedback, and terminal means at the end of, like your code feedback. You can give verbal and non-verbal communication feedback, we've talked already about thumbs up, smiley face, or gestures giving feedback and instructions. How much feedback you give, how often you give feedback is really important, really important to learners. And ideally the feedback, whatever you do, is constructive. Ideally it's positive. There are some times when negative is important. You need to be honest as well. But in the constructive context is obviously ideal. Amount and volume are the same. How clear your feedback is. Whether it's public in front of everybody, whether it's private, one-to-one, similar to the group or individual feedback. So that really wraps up the feedback section of this A4 topic. The second part of this topic is on goal setting and setting targets or SMART targets. Now, many of us, probably are happiest when we're in our comfort zone, we're training at a certain level, we're not too exhausted, we're within our skill set, we're performing where we can. But actually, in order to improve and in order to develop, You've got to get beyond that. You've got to push yourself a little bit further. You've got to be prepared to try new tactics or skills. Maybe get it wrong until you start getting it right. Leave your comfort zone and push your boundaries of performance. And obviously, goal setting with players as a coach, it should be really central to the part of the process. So the spec says we need to know about these sorts of goals and these sorts of target setting procedures, goal setting with SMART targets for individuals and as a team in these examples. So try to make sure that you give a sense of individual target setting as well as collective goals for a team. So something again I'm sure many of you will be familiar with is SMART targets, and there are slight variations on how this can be described. Smarter, there's a couple of extra bits that you can add in. So here's my sort of version of it. S is for specific, so the target set should be specific to the athlete themselves. They should be, if they're an individual target, they should relate to that individual performer, and it might be about, and they should be also specific to what energy system they're training, their anaerobic or aerobic, what muscle groups they're trying to work on and improve, or a skill, or it should be, the target should be specific to this person's position in the team. Ideally individualized. Of course, if it's a group or a team target, then it's specific to the team, of course. Goals are best when they're measurable. So ideally they need to be what we call quantifiable. How are you going to know if your players have achieved this target? So by saying, let's say I want you to have improved your shooting percentage by 5%, we can then measure later, and if they've improved by a value of 5%, then that's measurable. Percentages sometimes are a bit dodgy, but if we want to say we want to improve your power by, or your vertical jump by 3 centimeters, that's easily quantifiable. We can measure that and we can get a sense of improvement. Using numbers is often a really helpful way of making things easily measurable. Sometimes it's hard to measure things like effort because it's very subjective. Targets need to be achievable. So my basketball coach saying to me, right, in a month's time I want you to be slam dunking, is highly unrealistic and not achievable for me in a million years. So there needs to be a little bit of challenge, a little bit of outside their comfort zone, such that they might not necessarily get it straight away. It's got to be within their reach, but it needs effort and a bit of improvement to get them there. If it's too easy, that's not good. If it's excessively hard, that's not good. So it needs to be in that sort of borderline on the edge of their capability. Targets are also best when they're recorded. So sitting down with your athlete and having a chat with them and writing things down, even sometimes getting them to sign things, makes it tangible, makes it real. And it's something that you can refer back to. Having like a training log with regular target setting and reflection is a powerful tool to motivate us. So tracking changes, tracking those targets and the successes, or the rearrangements of those targets if they're a little bit too out of reach, that's okay, being comfortable to adjust them, but having them written down and recorded is a powerful strategy. T is for timescale, so it's important when you set a target that you say, right, I'm going to measure you again in 3 weeks, I'm going to measure, this is a monthly target or a 2-week target or a 6-week target, or even sometimes something bigger. Big targets are harder, you need short ones as well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But ideally there's a time scale to a target that is set, so it gives us an element of urgency. We've obviously got to reflect upon our progress, so not only measuring them, but are the targets I set you too easy, that you're achieving them too easily? Okay, I need to challenge you a bit more. Or if they're too hard, you need to be comfortable to adjust them. So constant evaluation of this process and progress so that you can tweak the training. If you're achieving them easily, I've got to make the training a bit harder and we've got to get you there. Or if you're failing to get there because your training's too easy, it gives you opportunity to adjust training to make sure that your targets and your progress is appropriate. Reward, actually something that can be quite powerful, using extrinsic rewards like certificates in some cases can be helpful, but even praise. And, you know, if you have a collective group meeting and you're giving feedback and saying, right, or I just want to say absolute congratulations to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so who've achieved their goals this last month, blah, blah, blah. That's lovely. That could be a really powerful motivator. What we don't want to do is put down other people who might not have achieved their target if they were trying their best. And then just as an overview, these targets really should be negotiated, and ideally they're not imposed upon the athletes. If you can sit down with them and agree them together and review them together and make them part of the process, that will hopefully sustain their drive and their motivation and their engagement with your targets. Okay, then so that's these sort of qualities of a target, what a target should be like. We've just got to now finish by looking at the different types of target you might wish to negotiate with your performers. So primary and secondary goals or targets. So a primary goal basically is the main focus of the performer. In a lot of sports, it's like a personal best, or to master the technique. Maybe it could be, you know, the quantity, the height that they jump, or to master the quality of the performance, how they do the skill. A secondary goal that might come along the way is maybe in order to achieve your personal best along the way, you might have a goal of trying to improve something that contributes to that primary goal. If I can make my gastrocnemius, my calf muscles, more powerful, that will really hopefully help me achieve my primary goal. So they are connected. The secondary goal is connected and kind of comes under the umbrella of the primary goal. Primary is the main focus. Secondary goal kind of happens along the way when you're trying to get your primary goal. So process goals are really important. They're often about mastery of skills. In this example, it could be that this athlete's process goal is to master the left and right-handed dribbling. So they're doing these drills to enable their dominant and their less dominant side become more equally coordinated so that they can use, you know, both hands interchangeably in the game well. So process goals are how you do stuff, the mastery of skills within a sport. An outcome or performance goal is slightly different. As it suggests, it might be a bit more to do with the final result of something. So an outcome goal could be, right, our goal is to have the outcome of winning or coming 6th in the league or winning by a certain number of points or not losing by a certain number of points. But ideally your goals are positive. So it's to do with the outcome of stuff as suggested by the outcome here. So we've already alluded to having a time scale to the goals that you set with athletes or with a team. You probably are familiar with different time-related goals though. So it could be that you're in a training session and you set your player or players or small groups targets to achieve within that session. So you could have something as small and immediate as a training session goal. And that, you know, that is highly motivating in that instant, in that training session. It could be how many reps they do of a certain exercise, how many passes they make. They are session goals or drill goals. So then you can have short-term goals. So these might extend beyond a session over a few days, over a week. The idea being obviously they're relatively proximal. They're quite near you. They're quite close. They're quite in your face. And short-term goals, I think, are almost the most powerful type of goals. If you only set a long-term goal and it's a year away, that's a blur in the distance. That has less power and less impact on you in terms of your motivation than session or short-term goals. So these are the bite-sized goals that get you through the next week, that get you through the next couple of weeks. And you can see there might be something over a day or within a month. Long-term goals, as I mentioned, are really important. So it's really common for coaches to set a long-term or perhaps a goal for the season with their player or with their team. And that's massive. That will determine what training you as a coach do with them to try and succeed with that season or year goal maybe. So these long-term goals, it could be a position in the league that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to win more games this season than you did last season. Your training needs to help you help you achieve those goals. There are also medium-term goals. So your spec doesn't have them in there. So, it could be by a quarter of the season or by half season we're trying to achieve this. And obviously they're in between those two. But they just make sense. This is the sort of bigger year or seasonal goal. These are the short-term goals that get you through those weeks and months to get you to try to achieve that season goal. And then the only other thing that your spec mentions is that perhaps having this future development goal. And this is something that's sort of bigger and broader. And what you're very much looking ahead to developing advanced techniques or tactics or personal best. Within the next X years, I want to be doing this and at this level and working in this and competing in these, at this standard. So that's very much an aspirational future. I'm going to develop over the next couple of years or seasons to aspire to this future development goal. And elite athletes have this. Sometimes I think we are guilty of living sometimes in the now, which is great, but sometimes having those aspirational future goals is really important. So there, just to finish on, a little summary slide, just giving you a sort of snapshot of the types of goal that you might wish to set with your individual or with your team. Just to remind you, you need to try to give examples that relate to a person individually or to a team collectively when you analyse this content and when you give examples of this content. So this topic has hit sort of two subtopics, one on feedback, how to give feedback, when to give feedback, what sort of feedback to give, feedback on what, and then following on from feedback, setting goals and targets with your players and teams or squad, how to set a goal or how to set a target, and what sorts of goals you might set with your individuals or players. Please remember that for your grading, what you do with this information or how you convey this information determines your grade. If you just give statements, it's pass level at best. If you just give descriptions, that's it. If you explain your points, you're more likely, through a variety of sport examples, remember, for this multi-sport job, it's perhaps merit level. If you can explain the pros and cons of all of these factors, if coaches do set SMART targets or don't set SMART targets, then it could be an advantage for this reason, explain it, or a disadvantage for this reason, explain it. That's the distinction level that hopefully you're all striving to achieve.